So I think we could start today because last week we didn't move forward. I figured this week we wouldn't have a presentation, so we can cover some extra ground and continue to move forward. And we are up to my notes on chapter 7, which is wine, fruits, vegetables, etc., and other blessings. If anyone has questions, comments, etc., please cut me off, tell me, let me know, so that we can make this as participatory as possible. Thank you everyone for coming, and let's begin. We're going to talk about the blessings on wine. That'll be the first subject. So if you have the notes for chapter 7, you can follow along in the notes, and let's learn a little bit about the blessings on wine. So go ahead.
Well, is this from the Torah or Talmud?
So this wine, the blessing on wine, is a decree of the rabbis. It's not from the Torah. Okay. It's one of the rabbinic decrees.
Oh, okay.
So all of the all of the blessings that we have on that we say before we eat are all rabbinic. So okay. Which is an important point, because it means that, remember that if there's going to be a question of doubt, we always take the lenient position. Okay. So first of all, what is wine? What is the definition of wine? So the definition of well, first of all, wine is considered a very significant drink. We all know whenever we do many of the mitzvot, we make a blessing on wine, like when we say Kiddush on Shabbat, when we on holidays, we say wine kind of accompanies a lot of the things that we do, because we find throughout the Torah, for example, the verse in the Psalms, verse in Tehillim, that says, "V'yayin yisamach levav enosh." Wine makes the hearts of people happy. Wine brings people together. It helps people socialize and so on. But of course, like anything, it has to be done in moderation. There's plenty of places in the Torah which criticizes people who drink too much wine. So just remember that there's a little bit of a danger when you're dealing with alcohol. But that doesn't mean we should avoid it. It means we have to, unless in certain cases it might be appropriate to do that. But because wine is so special, that's why wine was designated a special blessing. Every other drink, there's no special blessing for orange juice or any other kind of fruit juice. But for wine, we have this special blessing. The blessing is Borei Peri Hagafen, that God creates the fruit of the vine, of the grapevine, and that's the special bracha that was decreed by the rabbis to make on wine. Now, remember that we said when it comes to food, if a person says a hamotzi on bread, that afterwards he doesn't have to make a blessing on foods that he eats afterwards, because the hamotzi is like a primary food, and therefore it includes the other foods that you eat along with the bread. A similar idea applies to wine. If you make a blessing on wine, then during the meal, and if you drink something else, you drink a glass of water, a glass of juice, or whatever, that would be covered by the blessing that you made on the wine. There's also a special law. We're gonna get to this later when we discuss the laws of making a blessing after we drink or after we eat. We already talked about the laws of birchat hamazon, of grace after meals, of benching, but there's also a blessing that's kind of a mini grace after meals, which we're going to discuss in more detail later. But that, if you drink enough wine, which is a revi'at, which is about 3.2 to 3 ounces or so, or if you drink that much wine, then you do make that special blessing afterwards as well. There's, for those that have been learning the Daf Yomi, we've come across several times where the Gemara talks about diluting the wine. Apparently, those days it was the custom to dilute wine because I think the wine was maybe much thicker then. And they used to say that if you drink the wine before it's diluted, it's not, you don't make a hagafen because it's not good to drink it that way. But nowadays, the wine that we drink, we generally don't dilute anymore. So even though that was done in the times of the Talmud, that the dilution of wine is not considered an issue anymore today. The question is, what about if you take wine and you mix it with something, like you make a sangria, you mix it with some fruit, you mix it with some fruit juice, you mix it with some flavorings and so on. So here it's kind of, the issue is if you drink it, if you gave some of this to your friend, do you call it wine? If you still call it wine, then you make the blessing that you make on wine. If you don't call it wine anymore and you call it, spiked punch or something like that, then it does not any longer have the law of wine, and you would make just a shehakol, just the general blessing that you make on any drink. So that is a couple of things that about regarding the blessing that we make of hagafen on wine.
So
Yes, go ahead, please.
So what if you make a shehakol, but then it turns out you should have made a bori pragafen?
Good question. Thank you for asking. But because of shehakol, and we're going to get to this later, is kind of a catch-all blessing. So if you make a shehakol on anything, you don't make an additional blessing. So if you made accidentally a shehakol on something that you didn't realize was wine, then you would not go ahead and make another blessing. However, you would still say an hagafen afterwards, right? You would still say the blessing afterwards because you drank wine. Any other questions before I go? I'm about to start item 2E on the first page of Bar Hatova HaMeitiv. Any other questions on?
I may have missed this, but for the grape juice, is it just because it's a derivative of grapes? Is that why?
Yeah, well, the general accepted rule is that grape juice has the same law as wine. That in general, it's not. There's the poskim kind of there are some people that hold that if because it's not alcohol and it's not fermented, that it's a shehakol on grape juice. But the generally accepted opinion and custom today is that for most purposes, grape juice has the law of wine. But that is somewhat controversial, but it's become generally accepted that you can use, the grape juice has all the laws of wine. Thanks for bringing that up. I put that in my notes. I forgot to mention it. Anything else about? Go ahead.
Oh yeah. So you said there's no blessings for like other juices, like orange juice or other fruit juices. Is there a blessing for water or no?
Well, that's a very good question. In general, you say a shehakol, which is a blessing that includes everything that God created for us to eat or drink. However, there are some exceptions when it comes to water, and I promise we're going to get there soon.
All right.
Okay.
You may have already covered this already, but I can't remember. What is the shahakol, the blessing for everything in general? What is that? Have you got that already?
Yeah, the wording in Hebrew is shehakol nihiyeh bidvaro, that everything came to be by God's word. In other words, God created everything in this world. Okay. So that blessing includes, it includes all foods, and the details of that blessing we are going to get to, I promise.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. But we're just, so any other questions on the hagafen, on the wine blessing? Okay. So if there isn't, so there's another blessing on wine that we don't commonly come across, but it's something that we may have more opportunities to say this blessing than we realize. And that is the blessing of Hatov v'Hameitiv, which literally translates to God is good and he does good, right? That and Hatov v'Hameitiv is something, it has similar rules to the blessing that we may be more familiar with of Shehachayanu, that God has given us life and brought us to this time where we bless God for something new, something special. So Hatov v'Hameitiv is something, as a blessing that we're supposed to make when something really special happens, or we have a special kind of product. And one of those cases that the rabbis talk about is when someone brings in a really nice, good wine. So So if you're sitting down in the middle of a meal, right? And someone says, hey, I got this really great wine in the middle of the meal, and he brings it out to the table and everyone takes a little bit of this really good wine, that is an opportunity to make a blessing of Hatov v'Hametiv. So this is in addition to the blessing of Hagafen that you already made, say, like for Kiddush, say, for example. So I'm going to discuss now when you say this a lot, when you say this blessing Hatov v'Hametiv, and it's an opportunity that we may have on Shabbat. We just sometimes may forget or may not realize that we have this opportunity. So first of all, one of the rules, and this is in 2E number 1, I put in the note there that if a new wine is brought out during a meal, it has to have something special about it. Like, for example, something special that you didn't have yet during this meal. So for example, if you made Kiddush on a red wine and then someone brings out a white wine during the meal, right? Or if, you had just a regular, an average bottle of wine and someone brings out, a really expensive bottle. So then that would be a reason to say a new blessing. But if someone had an average bottle of Cabernet by Kiddush and they bring out an average bottle of Cabernet in the middle, that wouldn't count as a new one. But if it was new in the sense that it was more special than the one, it was a cheap bottle before, now it's an expensive one, that would be considered new. If it was a champagne or something, that would be a classic opportunity. If someone brings champagne out at dessert time, a classic opportunity to say Hatov v'Hametiv. Another thing about Hatov v'Hametiv, because of the language of the blessing, that God is good and he does good for us, it's really discussing a case where the benefit isn't just for you, but it's for other people that are with you. So it's a benefit not just for me, but it's a benefit for all of the people that are sitting around. So it's the only opportunity to do that is when we drink this wine together with other people. If you're sitting and eating alone and you have a cup of wine and then you bring out and you take yourself another cup of a fancier wine, you don't say the blessing Hatov v'Hametiv. There's another issue, and this is in E3, and that is that if the purpose of bringing out the wine, and I think we can imagine this, that if you went out of the way to buy a really special bottle and you bring it out because that enhances the environment, it enhances the atmosphere. When you bring out wine, people enjoy it, people like it, it's fun. When you bring it out for that purpose, then you make this blessing. But if everyone's drinking wine, let's say you make Kiddush on wine and then you run out, so you just grab the next bottle, then the purpose of it was just because not everyone got wine yet. So that would not count. That would not warrant a bracha of Hatov v'Hametiv. Now, on the other hand, if let's say you brought out a bottle and then someone else says, hey, I got a really great bottle of something else here, that I got, and he brings that out. And someone else says, I got a really good bottle here, and she brings that out. And people are, so then there's no limit to the amount of times you can say Hatov v'Hametiv, as long as it fills the qualities that we mentioned, as long as it's something new, something special, something different. If a lot of poskim say if you bring out grape juice, that doesn't beat out any of the wines, that would not count as Hatov v'Hametiv. And a lot of poskim make the observation that for some reason it's not common for people to do this today, and it's a blessing that a lot of us have forgotten. But it's actually a nice blessing because we bring out wine and people enjoy it. It's nice, and it's nice to be able to use that as an opportunity to thank God for the experience that we have of sitting around with friends, having a nice time, and drinking a nice product like this. So but before I move on, any questions about Hatov v'Hametiv?
Joel,
Yes.
it seems to me that this could be very nice, or it could actually embarrass somebody. I think you have to be careful how you do it, right? Like if you're the host and you serve a nice but moderate bottle of wine, and then your guest brings a really nice bottle of wine, so it would be very uplifting for the host to say Hatov v'Hametiv. But if it's the other way around, it could be very embarrassing.
That is a really good point. And I'm really glad that you brought it up. Yeah, I think Derech Eretz comes before being a mensch. comes before the blessing. That's a real, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, because definitely this is the kind of thing that you'd have to be careful for. And it certainly could happen, especially I think of other cases, but your case is a really good one. If you happen to be a wine connoisseur and the person that brought the bottle isn't, you have to try to be diplomatic about it. Any other comments or questions?
Yes, so I have a question. What if it's a dessert liqueur, not quite with like ice wine or something? Does it still qualify?
So the blessing as discussed by the rabbis was only on wines, not on liquor or other alcoholic beverages like that. So in general, I personally, I'm not sure why, because nowadays there might be other special drinks besides wine, but the one that's discussed in the Gemara and the one that's discussed in the Poskim is specifically wine. However, let me make a caveat. The blessing of Hatova Ametiv can sometimes be made at other times when you're really happy over a product that God has given you, and specifically a product that's good for you and for others. In fact, many poskim have raised the issue of saying Hatova Hametiv when you get the corona vaccine, the COVID vaccine. In fact, I actually did personally say this blessing when I got my COVID vaccine, because this is a product that God is providing us, and it definitely is tov, it's good for me, and it's meitiv, and it's good for everyone around me, because the vaccination protects the people that would have been exposed if I got COVID. So it wouldn't be, I think it's very, I don't think it would be wrong to say that if someone brought out a really special drink or something like really nice, usually expensive, but not necessarily something that you worked really hard on creating, it's probably appropriate to make a blessing in that kind of case as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? These are really good questions, so you can keep them coming. If not, I'll move on to the next topic. So the next subject is a different blessing, and those are I'm going to pair them. That's the blessings of Borei Pri Ha'adama. There's a couple other rules that just to know that about wine before I forget that wine, whether it's cooked or not, it can still have considered wine if it's a good quality, so on. But I wanted to throw that out there in case someone was wondering. But now let's discuss the laws of Borei Pri Ha'adama and Borei Pri Ha'etz. That's the Borei Pri Ha'adama literally means God who creates the fruit of the ground, and Borei Pri Ha'etz means God who creates the fruit of the tree. So in general, it more or less corresponds to what you and I would call today fruits and vegetables. But what's going to make this topic interesting is exactly what's considered a fruit and what's considered a vegetable. So we'll get there. And in general, when you and I talk about fruits, we're thinking about something that grows on a tree. When you and I talk about vegetables, we're usually discussing things that grow from the ground. Now, obviously, I personally am not a botanist, and I am not an expert on the different types of fruits and vegetables. But I know enough to know that modern science doesn't define these categories the same way that the rabbis defined the categories when they declared these blessings. So let's analyze these words, what they mean. Borei Pri Ha'adama, something that comes from the ground directly, and something that comes from a tree. Because obviously, just most vegetables that grow from the ground, well, the vegetables that are like roots, such as, for example, potatoes or carrots or radishes, these are vegetables that the vegetable itself literally is in contact and grows from the ground itself. That's clearly Borei Pri Ha'adama. There's no question at all. I know that we make the blessing from the fruit of the ground. When something, if you go into your backyard and you see an apple tree, that's clearly a tree. The apple grows on the tree, that's Borei Pri Ha'etz. But then there's a lot of things that are in between. So the general rule is, and I'm in my notes now in 3A1. in general, the rabbis considered something to be a tree if the stalk of the tree of this plant remains from year to year. So you go there in the wintertime, it's still there, and the next year it grows another crop of fruit. So from year to year, it grows another crop of fruit. So a lot of what you and I might call a vine, for example, some berries really grow on vines, right? But if at the end of the year, the berries fall off the vine, or you pick them off the vine and eat them or whatever, but the actual stalk of the vine remains, and the next year it grows another crop of berries, even though you and I might not necessarily look at that and say it's a tree, but halachically, that would have the law of a tree, even if the vine creeps along the ground and, so on. So that's rule number one. A tree, halachically, is defined again, and I'll say it again, it's something whose stalk remains from year to year, and it produces a new crop of fruit from year to year. However, you can have something that could very much look like a tree or look like a vine, and the thing that I'm thinking of is tomatoes. If you look at a full-grown, a nice big tomato bush, they can grow pretty big, and it looks like a vine. I mean, it is a vine as far as I know, and but however, the stalk dies, right? And the next year, either the tomato, there might regrow another vine if the tomato falls on the ground and plants itself in the ground and grows another vine, but that's a new stalk. So because the stalk dies each year, no matter how much it might look like a tree, no matter how big and tall a tomato vine might be, that halachically would be considered a vegetable, and it's borei pri hadama. It's not considered a tree. Now, I'm laying out certain rules that are obvious. We're going to get to some cases that are going to be a lot less obvious. So now the question is, what happens if the stalk dies? In other words, but the root inside at the ground, the base remains, and it regrows another stalk. Now, if someone is more familiar with growing bananas than I am, please chime in. But from what I understand, and from the way the poskim describe bananas, is that this is what bananas do, right? Bananas basically grow from what looks and appears and most people would call a tree. The thing is, though, is that after you harvest that year's bananas, the stalk dies. However, the base of the plant remains and grows another stalk next year. So this is like, so what do we do with this? On the one hand, the base of the plant remains from year to year. On the other hand, the stalk dies. So is it a tree? So is it ha'adama or is it ha'etz? Is it a tree and ha'etz, or is it considered a halachic vegetable? So the generally accepted consensus on the banana is that halachically it's considered a vegetable, but it's not so simple. That most people that I know, and the way I grew up, I always made a ha'adama on bananas because the stalk dies each year. But there are poskim that say that you should make a ha'etz, and it's an argument. I mean, I think the question is still out there, although it seems that most authorities that I'm aware of seem to consider it a vegetable because the stalk dies. So there's other fruits that cause even more problems, and as we expanded throughout the exile and as we spread across the world and people and Jews started coming to the New World and tropics and so on, we discovered all kinds of fruits and vegetables that we never knew existed before. So we encountered all kinds of problems. So one of those problems is the papaya.
Shmuel,
Yes, please go ahead.
so I have a question. When you were talking about the and I meant to ask you earlier, but I wanted to let you finish. I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about the blessings, the fruits that come from the tree, fruits that come from the vine, from the ground, and somewhere in between. And then you said the ones on the vine fell off the tree. So and you were saying that the one from the tree is different from the vine. You just said what it was. You told us what it was from the tree. But so I'm saying if it's the same thing, the vine is the same thing as the tree because it fell off, but it's still part of it, then why is the blessing for the wine, the vine, why is it borei pri hadama instead of what you said the blessing for the one for the tree in Hebrew, but why is it not the one for the fruit of the vine?
But that's a very good question, and
Okay.
the rabbis differentiated between a grapevine and all other vines.
Oh,
And a grapevine has the special law that when you make wine out of its fruit, you make a borei pri hagafen. Now, if you were to eat the grapes, like you had table grapes and you're eating the grapes, then that would be considered the fruit of a tree, just like any other tree. And you say a borei pri ha'etz, the blessing on the fruit of a tree.
Yeah.
But wine has its special significance because wine is especially significant.
Okay.
But that's a good point, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Thanks.
So you're welcome. No, I'm glad you brought it up because a lot of people could be wondering the same thing.
I think there's some people with questions, Shaul, before you
Okay,
move
please
on.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Mordechai, Chana.
This is Mordechai. My question
Okay.
concerns wine, concerns the first topic that you
Yes.
discussed. Suppose you're not particularly fond of wine, or even if it's a very good wine that you're given as a gift, are you still obligated to recite a blessing, or does that obligation defer to someone else? Or
That is a really good question. I am going to deal with that to some extent later on, whether or not if you're eating food that or drinking a drink that you really, really dislike, and let's say you're eating it because you're pressured to, because you don't want to embarrass the host or something like that, that the law is that you don't make a blessing at all. And we're going to get to that in a little bit more detail. But if you really dislike wine, and it's painful, but you're drinking it simply because you want to be social and you don't want to embarrass the person who gave it to you, under that circumstance, that's not, because remember, we eat because we've derived benefit and pleasure from it. And if it's not pleasure, it's not a pleasurable experience. There's other cases like that, which we'll get to. But I will discuss that after we talk about the laws of all the blessings before and after food. I'm going to have a paragraph, a lecture on miscellaneous laws about blessings, and that's one of them. And I'm glad you brought it up. So yeah, if you really, really don't enjoy wine, then if it's a painful experience for you, then no, you shouldn't make a blessing at all. But I'm glad you brought that up. And who else wanted to ask?
Mine was kind of a comment and then a question. I think these two categories could go pretty neatly into like annual plants versus perennial. The annuals are the ones that die off every year, and the perennials are the ones that live 2 or more years. And then that segues into my question of, in certain climates, certain plants can be kept alive for more than 2 years. For example, a tomato is a good example that you had brought up earlier. And also, I know that pepper plants in places where it's temperate most of the year, like, Northern California, Southern California, maybe Israel could be an example. Like certain plants can become perennials if they're treated with certain care. So I wonder if there's, difference with posthum and the South.
Yeah, so this is a really, really, really good question, and I'm kind of going to deal with it when I talk about papayas. Now, because the way the question of the papaya was presented to the poskim like 300-400 years ago, when they first came to the attention of the rabbis, and they also bring, for example, pepper, like you just said, pepper plants, and they also bring eggplants is a big example that they argued about. And apparently, just like you said, these are plants that can be and sometimes do be maintained for several years, right? So they're not long-lived like a tree that lives for 50, 100 years, however long a fruit tree lives, right? But they're not annuals. They don't die, and they do produce fruit each year, but they don't live. So on the one hand, they produce fruit annually, so you'd say, and the stalk, the trunk of it, the equivalent of the trunk remains. So it should have the law of a tree. But the poskim have to deal with a big problem. So the first reaction is to say, well, if it goes from year to year, even if it's only for a couple of years, that's still considered halachically a tree. Now, I'm going to put this question out there. Can anyone guess if we declare this a tree, there's something, this is coming out of left field, but what might then be the problem with eating, for example, a papaya, if it lives for 3 or 4 years? If it's a special law about young trees. That's my hint. I don't try not to go anywhere. Let's see if anyone can guess this one. It has
You're
to
not,
do with,
you're
say
not
again?
allowed to eat a young tree.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you for putting that up. So there's a rule the Torah says with a fruit tree that for the first 3 years, you're not allowed to eat its fruit. That's the root of an arlo, right? So the poskim are dealing with this crazy conundrum. It looks like a tree, it acts like a tree, but if we call it a halachic tree, then you could never eat a papaya, or pretty much, unless it's the 4th year. Imagine maintaining this plant for 3 years, which, as Hannah described, is not that easy to begin with, and you're never able to eat the fruit. So many poskim therefore tried as hard as they could to say that no, it's really a vegetable. It doesn't have a law of a tree, even though it grows fruit from year to year. But since it's only just a few years, it still has, and therefore that's become the accepted, in most cases, the accepted opinion. Because if we didn't take that opinion, then there's a whole long list of fruits and fruits/vegetables, whatever they're supposed to be called, that we'd never be able to eat. And those include, like I said, the classic examples that they discuss are papayas, pepper. There's a few others that I just don't recognize what the Yiddish terms are for them, but
My mother says it's in Chutz La'aretz, blueberries are considered ha'etz. In Israel, they're ha'adama.
Which one is that?
Blueberries.
Blueberry, yes, I saw that too. Blueberry is interesting because
In the cold weather, they can actually stay longer, but in Israel, they can't.
That's interesting because I saw thanks for bringing that up, because blueberries, I saw that the Israeli poskim wrote that it's ha'adama, and I said, I don't know. I mean, I used to go as a kid and pick blueberries, and they seemed like trees to me. But so yeah, here a blueberry is ha'etz. Thank you for bringing that up, because blueberries do grow from year to year, and they would therefore be considered ha'etz. But yeah, but I didn't realize that in those climates in Israel that so now I understand why in Israel they think it's a hadama, but it's great. So any comments about this subject? Any other questions about this one? Thank you.
I have one about the wand. One question about the wand, the blessing.
Yes.
So what did you say it was for champagne? I know you mentioned champagne earlier, but I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, so champagne has the same blessing as any wine, but I mentioned since in general it's a nice fancy wine, if you bring it out during the meal, you would also make the blessing of hatov v'hametiv, right? Because it's a special product that people are going to enjoy together.
And what about for like port or sherry, things like that?
Well, I mean, if you're bringing it out in the middle of the meal and you're telling everyone, here's a special wine that I have, and it's something that you didn't have yet that meal, then you would also say hatov v'hametiv. That would be an opportunity to do that. Okay.
Thanks.
Wait, Shaul, did you say also, as in first you first say borei, I guess pri agafen, and then you say hatov v'hametiv?
Yes. Well, in general, you usually don't need to say hagafen again, because you said it in the beginning. But unless it's something that was not available beforehand, like someone brought it from the outside, then you would have to say hagafen again because you didn't have that in mind. But in general, it's just hatov v'hametiv that you would make during the meal, because you already said hagafen. Okay.
Question on the wine.
What else?
Yes. What is the determining factor? Is it your liking the wine, or is it somebody else's evaluation of the wine that it is
Really nice.
that it is a really nice bottle of wine?
Yeah. So that's a good question, but I think the best way to answer that is to say if someone is bringing it out because it's something special and he or she wants everyone to enjoy it together, then that would be hatov v'hametiv. But if it's just, you're running out of wine on the table and you're bringing out some more, then then you wouldn't make the hatov hamitiv. It's really up to the experience of the people drinking it.
Okay.
I mean, for some wine connoisseurs, the wine that I think is good, they might not think is so good. You know, I'm not an expert on wine, but you know, for me, if you bring out a bottle that costs $5 more than the other bottle, I think it's fancy. You know, so it depends, you know, on the person and the experience.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I do. Again, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Was there another question?
Oh, I put in the chat about strawberries.
Yeah. So straw and the generally accepted practice is ha'adama, and I think that it's a similar problem to the papaya and the eggplant and stuff. Someone can correct me if they know more about strawberries than I do, but I think that even though that sometimes the stalk on which the strawberry grow might last from year to year, it's not a long. It's like only a couple years. It's not something that lasts. So it has the same conundrum that those other fruits and vegetables have. You know, so if we'd call a strawberry a tree, we'd probably never be able to eat a strawberry. So so therefore we call it a adama because it's not really a tree, even though sometimes it might have the characteristics of a tree. I think that's another example of the same phenomenon. And if I'm wrong about how strawberries grow, please, if someone knows, please feel free to correct me.
Rabbi, on the issue of Borel, how do we know if fruit that's actually adama is less from something that's less than 3 years old, like blueberries, for example?
That's a very good question. The general rule of thumb is that we assume a rove, like if, in other words, we assume the majority. So if you go and buy an apple from, you know, from the store, you, in theory, that apple might be from a tree that's less than 3 years old, right? But because the vast majority of apples are from trees that are older than that, you're allowed to assume that the apple that you're eating is not arla, is not less than 3 years old. You only need to worry if you know that's what it is. So if you're on a farm and apple picking, and the guy tells you, "Oh, these are our brand new apples. We just planted them 2 years ago," then you wouldn't be allowed to pick that apple and eat it. But in general, we can rely on rove, and the same thing would go. You know, if you buy blueberries, you can rely on rove. That most of them are from bushes that are older than 3 years. So it's yeah, and that's a good question, and it's an important rule that we did mention that on our list of acharei rabim lahatos. You're allowed to rely on the rule of majority, not only when it comes to opinions, but also when it comes to things like this. There's one other rule before I leave the topic of ha'etz and ha'adama, and that is that because a tree obviously grows from the ground, anything that you say on a and if you accidentally say pri ha'adama on something that technically should have been a fruit, then that's okay. That, in other words, you can rely on that blessing. In the first place, you should try to find out what the proper blessing is. But this is part of the reason why the poskim generally decided when it comes to the questionable vegetables, you know, the papaya and so on. They said, well, the bottom line is we're going to assume that it's a vegetable, and we're going to say that you can make ha'adama because a ha'adama works for fruit anyway. So even if we're wrong, you still made the right blessing, right? That's part of the reasoning. It's not all of the reasoning, but it's part of the reasoning why the general decision has been to make ha'adama. Now, if I don't know, does anyone? I know that pineapples also we make ha'adama. Does anyone here know? Does the pineapple, whatever plant the pineapple grows from, does it last from year to year, or does that also regrow? Is there anyone out there that knows that?
Are you asking if it's a perennial?
Yeah, is a pineapple an annual or perennial?
Well, you can ask Rabbi Google.
Okay, all right. Well, let us know what Rabbi Google says. I'm going to mention when we're about to study the laws of Shehakol, which it looks like we're going to have to go into next time. But I do want to mention one thing about the Shehakol, and that is that but there's actually a couple things that I want to mention that are relevant to the question of fruits and vegetables. One is plants, well, organisms that we eat that don't really grow from the ground. So, and the most common example are various fungi that we eat and mushrooms. Halachically, they are not considered fruits or vegetables. And the reasoning is because their nourishment doesn't come from the ground. At least that's how the rabbis looked at it. So those, you make the blessing of shehakol, which is, the catch blessing that's for everything that's not a fruit or a vegetable. So that's an exception to the fruit and vegetable rule.
What do you mean the nourishment doesn't come from the ground?
So the way the rabbis looked at it is they didn't see roots growing into the ground, and they also saw mushrooms and fungi that can grow on walls and on rocks, right? So they said, well, the nourishment must come from the air rather than from the ground. Now we know that when they do, again, I'm not an expert, and I please, if someone knows more, please let us know. But when they fix themselves on the ground, they do probably, I assume, draw some kind of minerals, that some kind of nutrients they draw from the ground that they're on. But in general, they don't draw their their nutrients from the ground. They make them on their own. So those have the blessing of shehakol as opposed to ha'adama.
Does that also include hydroponics?
Yeah, that's the next thing. Thank you for bringing that up. So that is a big debate. So what about fruits and vegetables? So here's the thing. What if you have fruits and vegetables that you grew, but you didn't grow them on the ground? You grew them on the water, like in hydroponics. So there's a lot of debate about that. And the post can bounce back and forth. But the accepted rule is that if it's a vegetable, it's a vegetable. And there's water in the ground. So if you grow it on water, the water is basically like growing it on the ground. It's like it's the same thing as it's part of the earth, so to speak. And the same question people have about seaweed. And let's say a lot of seaweed, some types of plants in the ocean grow from the floor, but a lot of the plants they float around and they grow that way. So a lot of them are edible. We eat a lot of that kind of seaweed. So it's also a big debate. But the most poskim have agreed that seaweed is also considered ha'adama, even though it doesn't actually root itself in the ground, because the lake or the river or the stream or even the ocean, basically the water is sitting on the ground. So it more or less is kind of like growing on out of the earth, even though we don't see roots in the earth. So yeah, that would be how most people deal with hydroponics and seaweed and other things. I'm gonna have to go into all the details of shehakol later, but because we're not gonna have time this week. But any other questions about fruits and vegetables that anyone wants to ask before we wrap it up for this week?
So the pineapple.
Yes.
Is a Talmudic fruit.
Really?
Yeah, it's perennial, sort of.
Okay. Okay. I wasn't aware that it was in the Talmud. I thought that's what.
Like,
Thanks.
Yeah, it's like, yes, it's a perennial, well, but sort of, and maybe. I think it depends on temperature and where it's growing. So it makes it interesting, and each plant seems to give in its lifetime maybe 3 pineapples.
Okay, so then it would go straight into the same category of all the other confusing stuff that I mentioned before, right? Is it a tree? Is it not a tree? And it makes sense that it's better for us. It's better for all of us if we decide that these things are considered vegetables rather than trees, so that we can actually eat them. Because I wouldn't want a world without pineapples. And if you call it a tree, then basically we'll never be able to eat pineapples anymore. So because they're all going to be less.
I think it seems to say that it takes quite a while for them to develop into a plant that makes a fruit. So it could be more than 3 years old when it makes its first fruit. Then what?
Oh, okay. Well, maybe. Well, in that case, I know from in general custom that people generally make a borei pri ha'adama on pineapples. There's a lot more questions we're going to have to deal with when it comes to the rules of ha'adama. And the question is when you take a vegetable and make it into a different form. We'll get to that next time. So I'm just going to throw out there some of the fun stuff we're going to talk about. Potato chips, Pringles, popcorn, vegetables in all sorts of forms. You know, when you make it into a dip like a baba ganoush, matbucha. I promised all those questions we're going to deal with next time, or you know, or what if it's fermented vegetables, pickled vegetables. That's going to be the fun topic that we're going to deal with next time. You know, raw versus cooked. We'll get there. We'll get there. All right. I don't want to go over the 45-minute time, but if there's questions or comments, please go ahead before we close up for today.
Shaul,
Yes.
question about hiates. Almost all commercial trees these days are grafted onto roots, and the root itself is quite likely, let's say, older than 3 years, but the graft that's placed on it might be younger than that. What counts as 3 years?
I'll be honest, I know that question is discussed. I don't remember what the, I think, well, I'm not going to say what I think. I'm going to put that on the table and I have to look it up. I'll be honest, I don't remember the halacha there. It is clearly written. I know the halacha deals with that specific question, but I can't remember offhand. But that's, if you could remind me, maybe just text it to me afterwards so I don't forget to look it up.
Are you going to be teaching next week?
Next week is actually the Maharat is going to be giving our
Roof, right?
Messianic. Yeah, she's going to be speaking next week. So next week is not me. The week after that, we'll discuss Shahakol, and we'll discuss all the other spin-offs of Ha'adama and Ha'etz, what happens when you take a fruit or a vegetable and you change its form or eat it in a different way and so on. So we'll discuss that all next week. So we're going to continue on with the same notes. Yeah.
Are we going to have the presentation that week, the next time you're here in 2 weeks?
I'm not going to promise, but I hope to come up with a couple of questions that I'm going to throw out there. Actually, let me throw out the following question. Who wants to handle chocolate bars? Does anybody want to tell us the laws of eating, what blessing to make on a chocolate bar?
Maybe we'll try that.
You want to do it?
Or maybe we'll give it a try.
All right, fine. So you guys can take the chalk. I do have it in my notes. I'll give you a hint. Okay. In the Shahakol, that's 4-0 number 3. I wrote chocolate bars there, and I wrote there that you could make an argument that you should say Ha'adama on a chocolate bar. But if you want to look it up, because even though I know that we always make a Shahakol, I personally have a reason to believe that we should make a Ha'adama on a chocolate bar. But if you guys can come up with whatever you want to. But I just gave some hints. But that would be a great topic to look up and to talk about.
Yes. Says Ha'etz.
He says Ha'etz on a chocolate bar.
Yeah, because it's,
right, so he I guess
the beans, their only use is for chocolate, and it comes from a tree. So
that's our.
Okay, well, so you have that.
I just complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I would have made a similar argument and landed on Ha'adama, but depending on how long the cocoa bean tree lasts, but whatever, we're taking away their presentation. Let them do the research.
Sorry.
But so you guys can talk about chocolate bars, and then we'll just continue this discussion where we're at.
Okay,
any other comments or questions?
Yeah, do we get to serve chocolate after we talk about the chocolate bars? Because
if you can figure out a way for me to give chocolate to everybody through Zoom, I'll get chocolate bars.
I think we should all have chocolate bars, and when they figure it out, we can do the blessing on chocolate and begin to eat.
Okay, sounds like a plan. All right.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
I had one more comment.
Good night, Greg.
Wait, you can ask. Go ahead.
I don't think grafted trees are halakhically permissible. I don't know if it's okay for Jews to buy fruit or buy the tree. I'm pretty sure it's okay to buy the fruit, but I don't know about like the laws around purchasing a tree that has been grafted. And most trees actually, from commercial order date to you planting it in the ground, are grown in the ground at the nursery for 2 years.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay, thank you.
So maybe we could
actually all the leading agricultural experiments on this began in Israel.
Yeah, we will. Hopefully.
Almost all commercial trees these days actually began with a graft on some other tree root.
Right. I mean, maybe we can do a Halacha Shiur.
Maybe we can put that on the list of
I don't know what
subjects.
that law is.
It'll be a while till we get to the laws of Arla, but we will eventually, with God's help, get to that specific subject of Arla. But we got a way to go to get there. But as far as if you graft a branch from a young tree onto an old stump, for example, whether that's considered Arla, there is an answer. There's a clear answer to that question, but I just don't remember, so I got to look it up.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Take care. Be well.
Good
Thank you,
night.
everybody. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.